Hey guys, welcome back. Our next speaker is Yehiel Cohen from Bar-Ilan University, who will tell us why presentism is not refuted by special relativity.
Well, I gave him a hard time pronouncing my name, but so good job. Well, it is often argued that the advent of special relativity has radically changed the concept of simultaneity and ends of time. However, two opposed theories about the nature of this change have been discussed in the philosophical literature. First, it is widely argued that the fundamental difference between Newtonian physics and special relativity lies in the fact that simultaneity is no longer an absolute relation that is the same for all observers, but rather depends upon a choice of an inertial frame. For example, if we assume that two events, distance events, E1 and E2, are simultaneous for me, and then that one other observer is in constant motion relative to me, then E1 and E2 are not simultaneous for me. This property is known to all as the relativity of simultaneity. Pursuing this astonishing consequence further, it is then argued that special relativity resolves the traditional dispute over the ontological status of the now. Briefly, as we already know, it is said to refute presentism, the view that only present events are real, and to confirm eternalism, according to which all events, whether past, present, or future, are equally real. It is also said to prove the time passage in the sense that the becoming present and then past or future events is not an objective future of reality. Now, according to the opposite thesis known as the conventionality of simultaneity, in a relativistic setting, simultaneity within any inertial frame is merely conventional. That is, it does not correspond to any objective element of physical reality. Hence, the relativity of simultaneity has no bearing on the problem of the now. My purpose in this talk is to, by analyzing the logical relations between the two theses, in light of the original metaphysical assumptions underlying special relativity, to claim that presentism cannot be refuted by special relativity. And now that's the outline, and we'll start slowly right now. So the argument from special relativity was first introduced by Putnam in 1967, though it was anticipated by Gödel in 1949. The argument is quite simple. It is based upon two principal premises. The first one is presentism. All and only things that exist now are real. And then what Putnam calls there are no privileged observers, through which he proposes a partial or explication of the notion of reality. So there are no privileged observer. Principle says that if it is the case that all and only the things that stand in a certain relation out to me now are real, and you now are also real, then it is also the case that all and only the things that stand in the relation out to you now are real. Well, usually this principle is taken to mean that R is required to be transitive, yet it amounts to much more. As pointed out by Stein in 1968, the no privileged observer principle requires us to be an equivalence relation. That is, the notion of reality which Putnam implicitly presents here is that reality is not dependent upon any particular observer, but it is single. So no multi-universe interpretation. The argument then proceeds as follows. Consider an observer A at rest at a space-time point O, and suppose that another observer B moving along X in constant relative motion coincides with him at that point. Let E1 denote the event of the meeting. Next, we bring in special relativity. According to the relativity of simultaneity, if events E2 and E1 are simultaneous for B, then they are not simultaneous for A. As we can see in the diagram, E1 precedes E2, that is, E2 lies in A's futures. However, and here comes the crux of the argument, B is obviously real for A at the point of the meeting, and E2 is present for B at O, and hence real for him, then employing the transitivity of the reality for relation, A is compelled to admit that E2 is real for him, though in his future. In general, any event in Minkowski spacetime can be proved real for A at O, and so we are forced to renounce presentism and declare that all future things, and I quote, all future things are real, and likewise all past things are real, even though they are not now exist. Patam concludes his paper with the following famous passage: I conclude that the problem of reality and determinateness of future events is now solved. Moreover, it is solved by physics and not by philosophy. Indeed, I do not believe there are any longer philosophical problems about the now. And with your permission, I'd like to stop here and make sure we are all on the same page and if there are any questions about this argument. Everything is clear? Good. So, many philosophers have taken Putnam's argument to have settled the debate on the side of eternalism. Nevertheless, the argument is not as conclusive as it seems at first. In his original paper about special relativity, Einstein argued that simultaneity of distance events cannot be empirically determined and hence must be established, and I quote, by definition. This claim gave rise to the conventionality of simultaneity thesis. The classical argument for this thesis is due to Reichenbach. Consider two identical clocks located at two distance points, A and B, in a given inertial frame. And let us suppose that a signal is emitted from A towards B, where it is instantly reflected back, as you can see in the diagram. That event E and E3 denote the emission and subsequent return of the signal to A at times T1 and T3 as indicated by the clock at A, and let event E2 denote the reflection of it at B at time T2 as indicated by the clock at B. So our problem is to synchronize the two clocks, that is to define T2 in terms of T1 and T3. Oops. Now, if arbitrarily fast signals were possible, the synchronization could be easily performed. E2 clearly occurs after E1 and before E3, that is, the value of T2 is between T1 and T3. As the signal's velocity increases, the interval T3 minus T1 is shortened and the ambiguity of T2 diminishes, allowing us in the long run to extrapolate the value of T2 at the limit, thus establishing a unique synchrony between the two clocks. Unfortunately, in a relativistic setting, the speed of light is the upper limit of the velocity of signals, and it is empirically determined to be finite, and the ambiguity of T2 cannot be dissolved. Okay, now let's try another way. Consider the second fundamental postulate of special relativity, the principle of the constancy of the velocity of light. Any ray of light moves in the stationary system of coordinates with a determined velocity c, whether the ray be emitted by a stationary or by a moving body. Hence, if d is the distance between the points, then to synchronize the clocks we simply need to set T2 with the following equation. However, this reasoning, argues Reichenbach, will not work either. The velocity c in the above postulate pertains only to the average round-trip velocity of light, empirically given by this equation. The one-way velocity, in contrast, say along AB from A to B, given by, cannot be measured by means of a single clock, but requires prior synchrony between the clocks. Hence, the proposed reasoning leads to a vicious circle. Okay, next. Reichenbach employs the verifiability theory of meaning, according to which roughly speaking, the meaning of a statement is reducible to the conditions of its verification. Of course, Einstein himself was not a verificationist. However, as it is well known, he was influenced by Mach's empiricism, and special relativity was founded upon a verificationist critique of earlier theories. And so, argues Reichenbach, our inability to empirically dissolve T2 ambiguity entails that simultaneity between distance events is not a matter of fact, but must be established by convention. Any given event in the open interval T1 and T3 at A can be defined as simultaneous with E2 at B, or to put it in Reichenbach's famous epsilon notations, have it over there. Now, Einstein's definition knows as standard simultaneity, synchrony, or simultaneity set epsilon as half. This one. Entailing that the light propagates at the same one-way velocity in both directions. That is not true for the non-standard synchronization. Now, our failure of the above single synchrony method does not preclude other alternatives, and indeed many methods, most notably the slow clock transport method introduced by Ellis and Bowman, have been introduced to show otherwise. Nevertheless, Sweeney in 1970 and Janis in 1983 proved all such methods to be physically impossible in principle. Now, let us revert to Putnam's argument. Putnam, as we discussed, argues that if B is real for A at O and E2 is present, and hence Putnam argues that if B is real for A at O and E2 is present and hence real for B at O, then A at O is forced to declare that E2 is real for him as well, although it is in his future. However, given the conventionality of simultaneity, this reasoning is altogether misguided. Indeed, E2 stands in a simultaneity relation with E1 for B. However, since simultaneity between spatially separated events is merely conventional and not an objective element of reality, the above assertion is devoid of physical import. Hence, we cannot conclude that E2 is real for B at O and therefore for A at O. Thus, Putnam's alleged eternalism does not follow. Actually, eternalism does not follow even from Putnam's own premises. In accordance with the no privilege observer principle, Putnam set a constraint on the reality for relation R. He argues that R must be restricted to physical relations that are supposed to be independent of the choice of a coordinate system. That is, it must be definable in terms of the intrinsic geometrical elements, a relation of Minkowski spacetime. This corresponds to events, light cones, and inertial wall lines, which are assumed to be empirically accessible to us by direct observation. However, standard simultaneity does not meet this constraint, and Putnam's use of it in his argument is entirely unwarranted. Questions so far?
Are you sure?
Sure about what?
Short clarificatory questions.
Sure about what?
You want questions?
No, just
That was my question.
okay.
So if you have short clarificatory questions about it.
Yeah, this is
Rather
actually this is the kind of questions I want to hear. So, nevertheless, special relativity still poses a serious threat to presentism. The no privileged observer principle requires the reality for relation to be an equivalence relation and to be definable in terms of the intrinsic geometric structure of spacetime. But if presentism is presupposed, can this relation be defined in Minkowskian spacetime terms so that it will not render all events real? And this is the first proposal, a very well-known proposal due to Stein. He argues that in Einstein's Minkowski spacetime, an event's present is constituted by itself alone. That is, the reality for relation is to be identified with the identity relation. Actually, Stein's, I believe, in a different version, he actually adheres the growing block universe, and not this one, but it doesn't matter. Technically speaking, this relation satisfies the above requirement. However, some philosophers argue that, metaphysically speaking, it is highly inadequate. First, it has been argued that this proposal entails an untenable form of solipsism. A single point, the here-now point, cannot be all that is real for an observer. Second, why should an observer privilege his own here-now point as the sole constitute of reality over other observer here-now points? The third one was offered by Putnam, and Yuval mentioned it yesterday. Suppose there's an event E2 spatially separated from E1, and so it is not qualified as present for him, and then with the course of time he becomes past. So we have events that become past without ever being present. Now, Stein's attempt to dispose with this alleged bizarre consequence is essentially similar to my response to Putnam's argument from special relativity. In this theory, the present tense can never be applied correctly to foreign objects. This is at bottom a consequence, and a fairly obvious one, of our adopting relativistically invariant language, since, as we know, there is no relativistically invariant notion of simultaneity. The appearance of a paradox only confirms that space-time of Einstein and Minkowski is quite different from pre-relativistic space-time. This is also the kernel of Stein's argument for rejecting Putnam's argument against presentism and advancing his own proposal. Now, we turn to another alternative relation proposed by Gottfried Smith in 1979. Gottfried Smith argues that in a relativistic setting, the present be identified with the class of events which are seen now by an observer. That is, the reality of any given event is constituted by the set of events which lie on its backward light cone. Interestingly enough, this relation was first considered by Einstein himself in his paper as a possible definition of simultaneity, and you can see the quote here. But eventually, as is well known, it chose standard simultaneity for practical reasons. Gottfried Smith, in contrast, argued that there's an essential difference between the two definitions. His proposed relation, unlike standard simultaneity, is definable in terms of the intrinsic geometric structure of Minkowski spacetime, and hence only it qualifies as the reality for relation. Well, the main objection to this is the past. So this is the present here for E, the past light one. The main objection to Cohen-presentism it is neither a symmetric nor a transitive relation, whereas the reality for relation is required to be an equivalence relation, thus leading to a multi-universe interpretation of special relativity, at least at this point, at point E2. Now, I believe that point presentism and Cohen-presentism are both untenable. However, I'll defer my argument for later, so you'll have to believe me at this point. So if I believe that point presentism and Cohen-presentism are untenable, it appears that the only way to retain presentism is to retain the pre-relativistic notion of an absolute spatially extended present. This solution may be implied by special relativity. To see this, let us re-examine the link between the conventionality of simultaneity and the relativity of simultaneity. Consider the following passage of Savitz. The controversial thesis that simultaneity is conventional is not to be confused with the thesis that simultaneity is relative. The latter is non-controversially a feature of special relativity. Now, although this sort of claim has often been repeated, it is obviously wrong. First, given the conventionality thesis, the fact that adopting the same definition of simultaneity, that is standard simultaneity, in all inertial frames yields different simultaneity relation is devoid of physical significance. Second, as pointed out by Reichenbach in 1928 and later on by Grunbaum in 1963, we can define an absolute spatially extended simultaneity relation even in a relativistic setting by employing an appropriate distribution of epsilon values. This result follows directly from the interesting fact that standard simultaneity in a given inertial frame corresponds to non-standard simultaneity in another. Hence, to define an absolute simultaneity relation, we simply need to fix epsilon as half in an arbitrary inertial frame and then adjust the epsilon values in the remaining inertial frames such that they will lead to the same result. Consider, for example, an inertial frame K and suppose that another inertial K tag travels in a relative motion along its x-axis. Let the epsilon values in K and K tag be epsilon 1 and epsilon 2 respectively. According to transformations formulated by Winnie in 1970, known as the epsilon Lorentz transformation, in which epsilon appears as a free parameter, just to note that the ordinary transformations implicitly take epsilon as half. The time coordinate of K tag is given by the first equation. Now, if we take epsilon 1 to be 0, and for simplicity's sake, we assume that t equals 0 and x is different than 0, then to establish absolute simultaneity relation, we must choose epsilon 2 equals this result. Of course, given the conventionality thesis, this result is also devoid of any physical significance. So now I turn to my final stage of the final stage of my argument, in which I wish to re-examine the conventionality thesis and to argue that although Einstein's standard simultaneity is not dictated by the facts, if one assumes a verifiability theory of meaning, then simultaneity between spatially separated events, not necessarily standard simultaneity, is after all a matter of fact. To see this, let us revert to the signal synchrony method. The light signal is sent from A at T1 and returns at T3. The question is, what happens to it while it is spatially separated from A in the open interval T1 and T3? Certainly, it does not cease to exist, at least according to special relativity, since the word line of the light signal is understood to be spatiotemporally continuous. Hence, for any given event in the open interval T1 and T3, the light signal constitutes at least part of its reality. In other words, having identified the present with the real, E and an event on the light's signal's word line are therefore really simultaneous. This is the reason I argue that point presentism and con-presentism cannot be sustained. That's because for any given event, some events that are spatially separated for them are real. Now, coupling this result with the empirical fact that light travels at a finite speed, so that it cannot occupy two distinct points along its path, it entails that E2 at B is real and hence present for only a single event in the open interval T1 and T3. That is, the verifiability theory of meaning actually suggests a weak reading of the conventionality thesis, according to which all choices of epsilon, where epsilon between 0 and 1, are empirically equivalent, but only a single value corresponds to actual reality. Now, the implications for the problem of the now are quite straightforward. First, as shown above, relativity of simultaneity is not an essential feature of special relativity, but depends upon a distribution of epsilon values in all inertial frames. All distributions of epsilon values in all inertial frames where epsilon between 0 and 1 are empirically equivalent, but only a single distribution of epsilon values corresponds to actual reality. Some distributions of epsilon values corresponds to some distribution yield an absolute spatialist extended simultaneity relation, and it is physically possible that one of them should coincide with reality. Hence, presentism is not refuted by special relativity. That's it.
Excellent. Questions? Okay. You had the first question last time, so let's start out with Leer. Okay, there you go.
Well, I just didn't understand the details. So the second point of your conclusion was that one value of epsilon is singled out in spite of the fact that all values are empirically
Yes,
equivalent.
only one.
But why was that?
Let's go back. First of all, we know that the first part of my argument was that light does not cease to exist in the open interval between T1 and T3. That's okay. We know that it's bad, and
We know that the light signal is going
going
place and coming back.
Yes, but and it doesn't cease to exist because its borderline is continuous.
And it exists.
Yes, all the way, all the
It
time.
doesn't exist now.
Doesn't exist now, but at T3 I know that it existed.
Yeah, but all these points on the trajectory of the light exist at their own place and time.
Right.
No one would deny that.
No, but my perspective is here at A. So I'm asking whether I can ask where is the whether it is meaningful to ask whether the signal still exists here. Is it meaningful to ask these questions? Or the question what happens on Andromeda? No?
Can you explain why not?
Why not? Why not? What do you mean?
So his view that it is meaningful to ask whether it exists,
Yes.
and the obvious answer according to him is that yes, it does.
Someplace, somewhere.
Yeah, but what's the argument?
No,
No.
this is the first time
I feel that that's meaningful.
No, that's meaningful, and I know it's somewhere. And I also know that the velocity of light is finite.
But
So
that, if you say, I know it's somewhere, that means that you assume that there's an extended now.
no, this is actually an empirical fact.
Because you mean it's somewhere now.
Somewhere now for here.
Yes,
At this
but
point,
you
yes.
said you already assume that there is an extended.
No, I'm not saying this is an empirical fact. Because I know it is somewhere from the, because it's at T3 I know it's back, and I know it didn't cease to exist.
No, perhaps better to postpone this discussion.
Okay, sure.
Yeah?
Just into the just a minor point about point presentism.
Yes.
I mean, maybe there was something I don't understand in the argument, but this argument that an event can become past without ever being present
Yes.
is usually put forward against time.
Against.
And I think it is somewhat, it seems to me that it somewhat goes off the mark in some sense, because in Stein's view, I mean, you said it yourself, every event is present in and for itself.
Right.
So in this sense, E2 is present for itself in the very same sense, you know, as the
I'm sorry, I lost you again, the last part again?
I mean, you had this example with E2 that
Yes.
it becomes past without ever being present. But I think it's a little bit misleading to say this.
Right,
There's an objection to Stein, because in Stein's view, we already admit.
Right. This is Stein's answer for the
That's his answer.
Yes.
So he's right. I mean, you can't blame him about something that, I mean, it is present. It is just that every event is present for itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's the feature. So, so I think that this particular objection is not really,
I just wanted to clarify something in response to what Meir just said. If I understand correctly, the dialectics between Stein and Putnam at the time, because in fact what Yehiel presented, what you're saying is Stein's view is, in essence, at least metaphysically, accepting Putnam's position, namely it's accepting the B theory. Whereas Stein's original purpose was to answer.
No, it's not accepting. It's both against Putnam.
No. This goes back to my discussion with Ulrich yesterday. The notion that at every moment, and we can, at every event is present when it happens. That for me is the B theory.
Okay, fine, but that's.
I mean, I don't know any other formulation of the B theory. So
no, but I'm saying I'm just saying, to be fair to Stein, I'm just saying if we criticize him on some point, let's do it only once and not twice. So I mean, I agree that that could be an objection against Stein, but then you cannot add to this objection another objection which says that an event may become past without ever being present, because it's already the same objection. I mean, you can't say it.
I'll be very nasty and I'll criticize him twice. First for thinking that he answered Putnam when in fact he endorsed Putnam's view, and secondly, answering Putnam in a way that contains a serious confusion, because according to Stein's understanding of his answer to Putnam, I can from here say about a distant event that it's future, and I can say from here about a distant event that it's past. That was Stein's purpose, to reintroduce tense. But I can never say about those distant events, I can't say that they're present. So I think it was a serious muddle.
If I may just abuse my position, probably to add one twist to what you said, is that I do think that's something that is weird about the point like now view, is that we have these events, so from my perspective, they're events that were future for me, and then they became past for me, without ever being present. That is, here I am, I'm moving through time, and there's stuff added to my past that never kind of went through me. It never checked in with me. All of a sudden it was there. So yes, it was present for itself, that's fine, but it was never present for me. So I think that perhaps was what people object to. I mean, but I think you can also say, hey, special relativity is weird and it's a feature, not a problem.
Yes, it is weird already, but I think it's a weaker objection than it sounds at first sight. I mean, in the context of Stein's view. And also, I mean, if I may just add one little point, from the outset, I'm not sure that Putnam's, I mean, if we have this view about presentism, and then Putnam comes with this argument from relativity, and there's a whole discussion about space-like events and so on, and I'm not sure that from the outset, I mean, I'm not sure that, presentism was not about, is about what exists now, and not about necessarily about space-like. And this is a feature of relativity theory. But so I think that there was a sort of a little bit of mismatch here. That it is not surprising after all that Stein could come up with a view which saves, at least formally, presentism in the context of relativity. Because I mean, Putnam's argument sort of presupposes certain views about presentism which are not there in presentism. It is natural that you would accommodate the metaphysical, but you're given a certain physical theory.
I agree.
Further questions? Yes.
There is space-time, there is space and time, and there is also space-time.
Yes.
So time is time is present.
Time, I'm sorry.
Huh?
Okay.
Excuse me.
So we can questions?
Okay. So you seem, in the first part of your talk, you seem to accept the conventionality of simultaneity.
Just for the sake of argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There has been a lot of literature about this, of course.
Yes.
One of the contributions is about David Malleman.
Yes, of course.
All the things that
I
follow.
was waiting for this question, but David Malleman's yes. Well, his argument deserves a whole talk, an hour at least. So we can talk about it later. I believe that Malleman is also wrong. Because, yes, he implicitly assumes epsilon's standard simultaneity in his argument.
You say he assumes that.
Yes.
He claims to derive it.
Yes, but I believe that's, yes, assumes it.
Okay, that's interesting.
Did you send it your...
No. But I have it here with me, so
Okay.
we can discuss
We
it.
can discuss it later.
Okay, sure.
I'll do it.
No, if we have a little bit more time, I thought that we can connect this talk to your talk yesterday and just try to clarify these few points which I think are confusing because, as I said before, Stein supposedly wanted to show that you can say presentism in the context of relativity theory, but in fact the view he was putting forward was very similar to the view you were putting forth yesterday, and you're no presentist. So it always bewilders me that the idea that things are present when and where they happen is a form of presentism. It bewilders me that people take that to be a form of presentism, whereas Ulrich said, I think in one of your papers you said that the basic tenet of the A theory, that only what exists now is real, is either trivial or absurd.
Well, it's either, so if the thesis of presentism is that only present objects exist, well, what I argue is that exist is ambiguous between two readings. It could either mean all that exists, the only things, only present objects exist. One way of reading is to say that only present objects exist now, in which case, of course, the thesis is trivially true. Or it could mean that the only things that exist are... and I'm confusing myself here.
No, what you were saying...
Okay, now I get it. So either the thesis is trivial by claiming that only present objects exist now, or it's obviously false by saying that everything that ever has, does, or will exists now, and Julius Caesar did exist, doesn't exist now. So that's kind of...
Right, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that's true. So the first option is trivial and therefore acceptable by everybody.
Yeah.
So no B theorist, right, would contest the first reading of presentism. But that's the Stein kind of that's the position that Stein offered as something to reconcile with relativity theory. So in fact, what he was offering to reconcile with relativity theory was something that any B theorist would be very happy. In fact, what he was offering was what Putnam was trying to argue with that original argument to begin with. And I think that the serious challenge is to flesh out not presentism. This is presentism. To flesh out what tense is in a way that is compatible with relativity theory, but which doesn't fall into either triviality or absurdity, as you just pointed out. And that requires, I think, again, moving away from an ontological understanding of tense.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something about it. I think as Yehiel showed, even it was very soft here, but Stein, I think, formally refuted Putnam's argument. Formally, because Putnam, in his argument, Putnam wanted to say or no that in relativity theory, given relativity, special relativity, there is no way to, within the resources of the theory, to define the becoming relation. And Stein showed that there is a way. So that's a refutation of the general claim of Putnam. Formally, it's a refutation. Now there is a question, the question that you bring up, I think, is a question about whether Stein's, whether the way to define becoming, or to characterize becoming in the context of relativity, somehow meets our intuitions about becoming in metaphysics. And what you are saying is that it doesn't.
Not in metaphysics, in experience.
Or it is, yeah, of course. I mean, metaphysics is also, supposed to be, supported by experience and so. And I may as well, and maybe also Yehiel, I don't know. I mean, I may as well agree with you about that, because in becoming there is, implicit the notion of the passage of time, and the notion of the passage of time. And this is, in this sense, I'm not sure your criticism of Stein in particular is fair, because you could say it about everybody who tries to define becoming in the context of relativity, even about it's not clear that physics, in the way it is now understood, has the resources to do it, but not because of becoming in particular, because of the passage of time in general. So it has nothing to do with Stein's particular. Stein refuted Putnam's argument in a sort of a formal way, and now we want to know, we are back at the question, can we make sense of becoming in the context of relativity? And there is a difficulty about it, because there is a difficulty about making sense of the passage of time, in the metaphysical sense. I
think we're overall clear.
Well, I disagree with Stein, because we are not alone. Because I want to believe that. We are not alone. So this is what I was trying to show. We are not alone.
Who are we?
I'm not alone. I myself am not alone.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit embarrassed because I'm more puzzled after 3 days of this gathering than I was 2 days before. And my main embarrassment is because I feel we are always change hats between a global point of view and a local point of view. And we do this, some of you, not me, but we always we change it for our own convention. Just when Dennis wrote talked about
convenience.
Sorry?
You mean convenience?
Yes, convention. Yes. Dennis talked about becoming, but becoming special relativity is in our local point of view. And now we are talking about present that is a global point of view. And I don't think that even what Yehiel talked about, that an event that can pass from the future without going to the present, we are mixing between a global point of view and a local point of view.
You mean Putnam, not me. That's Putnam.
Yes. And this is also, it connects me with the gentleman.
So the objection makes use of an intuition. If it's a global point of view, it's essential. I mean, the objection that the point goes from future to past without being present. This hyperplane in thought. And
well, globally.
Without it, there's no objection at all.
That's true.
It seems very difficult to see how we can make any sense of experience without granting ourselves some kind of access to something distant. That's what I was trying to argue with you yesterday. And by distant, I don't mean Andromeda, I mean the tip of my finger. If I can't access the tip of my finger, I don't know what's...
You can't access it, but it's a little bit in the past.
Should we go into the final discussion, maybe?
Okay, so why don't we thank Yehiel again, and
Okay, we're we're going to go directly into, no, we're going to go
Yeah,
directly.
he didn't like that 2-minute break.
I don't want any 2-minute break.
Yeah, yeah,
I'd rather have a short session and finish early and do it that way. What?
We don't need a 2-minute break.
You don't need a 2-minute break because I will talk for 4 minutes, maybe 6, no more, and then I'm going to open the discussion because this discussion has one purpose, which I think was about it in the last comment, which was to try to figure out what have we been doing and why, and what has been united these lectures. Now, I would like to start by suggesting, first of all, that we have, pointing out just anthropologically, that we have 3 groups of people here, and it's sometimes confusing, because there are the continental philosophers, the analytic philosophers, and also the philosophers of physics. Analytic philosophers and philosophers of physics, I hope it has become clear, are not the same thing. And because they're not the same thing, there is some kind of triangulation between these 3 groups in terms of what they try to explore. Now, the question that we faced, first of all, was whether we pay any attention to phenomenological appearance. In other words, to phenomenal appearance of how time is viewed in experience at all. And some people suggest that there has to be an analogy between how time is viewed in experience and how it would be in reality or in the world. My own feeling is that that's something that remains to be demonstrated, because you may suggest that the laws for organisms, and this is something that physicists won't like, but that the laws by which organisms order themselves in time are constrained by physical laws, but beyond that constraint, nothing very meaningful can be said specifically about them. On the other hand, the idea that you derive the time from physics, from the time of physics from the time of experience, while I suppose true historically, makes no sense at all to me. Makes no sense at all to me because I don't see how, on the intuitions that we have of the world, we can proceed to positions that from our own experience are basically counterfactual. You know, the non-existence of simultaneity between me and an object in special relativity may in fact be true. Try organizing your life on that principle. It obviously doesn't work, and I don't think one maybe have derived from each other historically, but I don't imagine that there's a way of deriving the time of physics from the time of experience that really can function except as one path or another. But that's a big question, because the question is that remains on this dimension is to try to find out where the time of experience and the time of physics get together or they don't. And the problem there is, of course, that we don't have a very good idea of what the time of experience is. We have probably, it seems, because it's in mathematical formula, that we have a better idea of what the time in physics is. But of course, even in the time of physics, as you saw, there are great dilemmas which are largely unsolved. But the time of experience is really up for grabs. It's up for grabs, as was noted by the comment that was made this morning on memory, the idea that memories are of the past. But memories are not really structured internally as being the past. If you look at memory very carefully, memory is actually spatial and simultaneous. It tells you where the honey is if you go left in the field, because you were in that field a few years ago. And anybody who deals with memory studies knows that while they are of past events, those past events are given as a block. Those past events are given as a block. Very few memories that we have are sequential. And that is because memory is fundamentally, I think, about orienting yourself in an environmental world. It's, in other words, it's the memories that you have that you're conscious of is what you need to know. Like, are the dishes in the cupboard in the kitchen, or aren't they in the kitchen? And that's the kind of memory you don't pay attention to because you like to think of the Madeleine and Proust and how you experienced life. But 95% of the memory you have is whether the cupboard is in the kitchen or something like that. And that's just what you have to know. And that's not internally structured.
If I ask you, do you remember yesterday I went to see a film, for example.
No, but that's an experience. But I'm saying all of the memory of experience is secondary to the memory of utility. And I'm saying that all the memory of experience is not primary memory.
You said that there was no time order in the content.
No, there is one that you attributed sometimes, but most primary memories don't have internal time order. And they don't have internal time order, if you look at it, because they actually strive for simultaneity. And they strive, it's not important to me if I want to get to the Knesset, to know whether I have to know what the direction is as a simultaneous set of things. It's not important to me to try to understand the last time I was at the Knesset. Gregson played this out.
If you want to get to the Knesset from Haifa, you do remember
You don't remember the
last time you did it.
No, you don't.
Remember that first you got to Jerusalem.
Yes, but you don't remember it as a specific memory if you did it every day. And you don't remember it as a specific memory at all. And the point about memory is that I think that memory is not meant to be specific, autobiographical, or experiential. And it has nothing to do...
So you count as memory something that other people might count as knowledge?
I think that all knowledge has to be remembered. And because all knowledge has to be remembered, the question is what kind of knowledge is it that you have to know? And I think that the knowledge of how to kill a horse, or to kill a mastiff mammoth in 30,000 years ago, when your memory evolved to be able to do this, is a kind of, you don't remember how and where and when you acquired the knowledge. You might, but it's not necessary to know how to kill a mammoth or how to skin it or how to prepare its parts to know all of that. Now the reason I raise this is because I want to say is that we don't have a good idea of what experience is. We have the Heideggerian idea, experiences unto death, and everything else. All I was trying to suggest is that we want to say the time of experience, and we want to say the time of physics, and we think we know what these concepts are. Time of physics, there's a huge amount of vagueness about it. We heard it. But the time of experience, of course, is we have no boundaries for knowing what counts as experience and what doesn't. And that's why all the analytic philosophers and philosophers of physics will say it's vague. On the other hand, it's obvious to all of us that in terms of the meanings which we attribute to ourselves in life in any way, it's the time of experience that counts and not the time of physics. And we have tremendous amount of discomfort with that. So that's one thing I wanted to raise, that I think we raised and that I think deserves further consideration. That's all I'm trying to say. The next thing is that we have to ask ourselves, and one more thing I want to say about that is this, that furthermore, we heard, for instance, in Deleuze about the subject and the object, and the time is neither subjective nor objective, or we say time is experiential, or it's the world, but it should be obvious to all of us that the world is as ambiguous a concept as anything else, because is this the world of physics, is this the world of Heidegger, is this the world of meaning? That when we use the word world, it's at least as ambiguous as the Ayahid, and that the world, which is presupposed by physical theories, is a certain kind of a world. But it's not at all the meanings which we use, with all the meanings we use world, and that concept of world that we have is not necessarily the world of experience, because you can have experience, you can have the physical world, and you can have a third world which you don't experience, but which is not the physical world, say the world of Chinese speakers, or something like that. I've never been to China, so that's why I've brought it up, but that's a world, the world of Chinese speakers, or something like that. It's not my world, but it's also not the world of physics. And there are lots and lots of worlds like that, and one of the things that we have to think about, and that we have to be careful about, is to which we are referring, especially if we, as I think there was a drive, we kept trying to find equivalences, and say that in this kind of discourse, this is what happens, this kind, and therefore we can unite them. And I'm not sure that's true. Now, the other issue that was brought up was the issue of language. And the issue of language is, of course, maybe we think about things the way we do just because we talk the languages we do. And if we didn't, then it wouldn't, that meaning in that sense, and you then would have three things: meaning, language, and physics. And in a sense, and the reason I suggest that is that the meaning, the existential meaning of my life, you assume, despite what Heidegger says, you assume that a chimpanzee also has an existential value to his life, even though he can't use language. And then you assume, on the other hand, there's a physical world, and then there's language, which has a certain kind of way of being, and we did not address that enough. And I think we did not address that enough because language frames the way we think about time, and it frames it in certain ways that have to do with physical constraints of language. You notice that I'm speaking at a certain speed by taking phonemes and putting through my mouth, and no matter how fast I speak, no matter how much I try to speed it up, there's a limit beyond which I can't go. And the point is, there's a limit beyond that. And not only that, you have to create messages of sense on the basis of this phonemic underpinning to what I'm saying. And because you have to create a sense out of that phonemic things, that means that at some point in time, like 50 or 60 or 100,000 years ago, somebody must have figured out that they have to take the images that are in their mind and decompose it into phonemes in order to communicate to another person. That's a neat trick. Because you think about how you can decompose a picture into phonemes, and get your message out to the other side, and you'll see that it's a huge paradox, and it forces you to think about sequence and tense in certain ways, because language itself is directional and sequential in certain ways, and that form, idea, I would suggest to you that the idea of direction that was brought up here, you have to think about how is direction different in the cosmos from the way in which direction is different in language, if at all. And the same thing is true then about tense, because tense, of course, Fine would tell us a subjective experience, but tense is also a structure of not all languages, but of most of them. And because it's a structure of most of them, in some languages, like Indo-European ones, it's highly elaborate. In Semitic languages, it's much more primitive, and in Finno-Ugric languages, it's even more primitive. But the point is that in all these different forms of language, they have different kinds of markers for time, and for time in ways that make sense to people in terms of communication. In other words, communication does go on. We didn't think about that. That was raised about moves. Now, the big question that raised a lot of people here, concerned them, was the existence of the specious present, the extended present, presentism in physics. That was a big question that came up again and again in this conference, and I think that it's a question that repays perhaps a special conference, because there is, of course, what Sean Gallagher says in The Ordinance of Time, which is a book he wrote about phenomenology, where he tried to point out the idea that Husserl and all these people had was of an extended simultaneous present, the time of retention. So it actually physically, in terms of moments, takes you a minute to hear the phrase da 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 da. But for Husserl, it's simultaneous, in other words, because it's a unity of sense. So the question here that we have to ask ourselves is what we really mean by the present, and is there commensurability between these different concepts of the present that we have, because you're talking about one kind of present, and I'm talking about another kind of present, and of course, what Husserl noticed was that if you have the kind of present Brentano has, which is a short, tiny kind of a moment, then it cannot bear the weight of all the sense in which we try to have it. Just isn't long enough to bear this weight of what I'm talking about, so that to refer that to that instant, the fact of my talking about it is actually a trick. And because it's a trick, we then talk about the present, and it's an abstract structure in that way. Now, when we talk about simultaneity, of course, in physics, we're talking about really the microsecond. An instant. We're talking about instantaneous simultaneity, and my point is instantaneous simultaneity, for some of our traditions, is never given in life, at all. And because it's never given in life or in experience at all, that's Heidegger, Husserl, whoever you want, therefore, the idea is that it's a construct. You have to think about what is the relation between this as a construct or as a moment of measuring reality and the fact that we have no categories for presentism in this way. In most of the languages we use, as you know, Hebrew doesn't even have a worked out present tense at all, because it just assumes that if something is present, then it's present as substance, and if it's present as substance, you don't have to conjugate it. And that's it's not me, that's people in antiquity. Now, there was a lot of talk this morning, which I was very glad about entropy, because I think that the question is that, we talk about entropy, and I don't know physics, so I'm just making this up, but entropy is, of course, increasing disorder as we laymen understand it. Just to put it simply, and if it's increasing disorder, you have to think, does entropy, I would raise to the physicist the question of, does entropy itself change the nature of time? Because if objects are moving in space-time all along and you have entropic phenomena, you can assume that entropy, the time is not a constant for entropy, but that entropy itself works back on time in some way. And I think that there is a tendency that we have, that's a Kantian tendency, to talk time, even if you've done relativity in theory, as something that's constant, or that's the axis of our measurement. And if there was anything we got out of the discussion, that I got out of the discussion of the physicists, that is, in fact, time is not in that Kantian sense a constant. And if it's not in that Kantian sense a constant, in other words, invariant. If it's not invariant, then, of course, then a lot of games are opened up. So now the final point I want to raise is about science. And about science, of course, is a great mystery to people like myself. But the point is this, that what we normally do in philosophy, or have done in normal times in philosophy, is we learn a little bit about science and then we adjust our philosophy to science. And that's been going on for 200 years. But what do you do when the science is not clear? What you do, not because it's provisional, for Désiré Cardinal Mercier, at Louvain, the late 19th century. He wrote great books about philosophy based on positivist science. In the generation before Einstein was able to do that, because he was sure that this was the truth. But you see, this is actually what emerges, that it's not. And so, how do you philosophize about something which is not resolved in terms of itself?
That's
and then
what you do in philosophy of physics.
That's what you do in the philosophy of physics. Well, the point is this, that, for the rest of us, though, it becomes a little complicated, because we mathematical notation for somebody like me is itself esoteric. You see, so these are just the points that I got out of this. Oh, and let's see. Yes, that's all I wanted to say so far. And I would like to throw open the discussion, and then at the end turn it over to the organizers and ask them to make a concluding remark. So this is a good time for everybody, as this gentleman in the back did, reflect on what was going on in the conference and try to come up with your own, share your own understandings of what you heard. So the floor is yours. You don't have to be polite. Somebody's, yes. You start and then him. Those are the two hands I saw. Yes, you.
Well, I think that many of the points you mentioned indeed were put in a very interesting way in the various discussions we had here. I think that it seems to me that the kind of discussions we had here are important, because, as you just said at the end of the things you said, there are many. I mean, one doesn't have to go blind after whatever it is that we think that physics is saying, or that, because I mean there's a physics is a sort of a empire. I mean it has a. I mean, yes. And I share this view. I mean, I think that physics is supposed to explain the world, and the world is everything that we know. So, I mean, but it is very. This is why it is very difficult. And many of the issues that we have here, for example, about time and about the passage of time and stuff like that, are not. It is not yet clear, even though there's a lot of literature about these things in the context of physics, but still it is not yet clear how exactly should we understand the passage of time in physics.
Yeah.
I mean, even though time as a parameter appears in physics, and as I tried to explain this morning, I think that questions about the passage of time can be thought of. I mean, if you go a little bit more into the details of the physical theories, you see that there are lots of assumptions there, philosophical, assumptions about which we philosophize in philosophy. There are lots of assumptions there that get into the theory, nobody implicitly, and then people start running and so on, but doesn't look back anymore.
Well, for an anti-entropic organization like we are, ideas of continuity are very important. Now, they may not, in fact, be physically based, but in other words, for me, it's much more important, rather than to know whether you are at T2 when I'm at T2 or something like that, to make sure that I was at T1 and am at T2 and I'm going to be at T3, and because it's a much more important point than for me, that when I regard my own trajectory, I'm interested in the whole of the trajectory, that rather than my being at any one instant on that trajectory, or who else is on that trajectory.
Right, yeah. But what you said now is controversial. I mean,
I hope so.
It is, no, I mean the start of the premise of your.
Okay, we're going to go 4 counts. There's a gentleman in the back, then Yuval, and then over there. Yes. So first of all, the gentleman in the back.
You remarked about the philosophy of time regarding language, and said a person creates thought, a person tries to convey an image, and then he tests it by speaking about it. But on the first day, you remarked, had an interesting remark about spatializing time. You said we temporalize space.
That's right.
Space. Because space needs time to be measured. So would like to learn or listen to what you have to say about it. And another remark regarding music that was given an example right now, and also on the first day a few persons talked about it. Well, music is based on a recognition of a cyclic repetition of pitch. And cyclic repetition of pitch, the trajectory of a sound, you don't need to have the whole sound in order to predict that trajectory.
Yes. So that's...
So if you take it further, you can hear music simultaneously. Maybe the most famous example is Mozart. None of his score had any erasure, anything.
Well, I'm not going to answer all your questions because a lot of people are in line to speak. But I think it's an important point to think that of what you would call the non-identity of the parts. Language is based on the idea that it's like a tool. In other words, in tools you know the different parts that when you have a tool are not like the tool. They're not little homunculi. They're dissimilar parts that you've put together in order to make a hammer or something like that. And language is very much from the beginning, it's predicated on the recognition by people who cannot read or write, your ancestors, who cannot read or write, that they can take dissimilar parts and put them together into a framework that gives a total meaning. That's a tremendous insight. It's a tremendous insight. And I think it also animates much of our scientific work, to think that the parts are not in somehow ways are in a relationship of resemblance to the whole. Yuval.
Maybe you wanted
Yes. Okay.
I want first of all to say how gratified I was by your remarks a little while ago. This workshop has a focus, which is, I'm reading here, cosmological and conscious time. And one of my reflections would be this, that when we start thinking about cosmological time through physics, we start thinking about time from a more scientific point of view. But then there are other sciences, like biology,
That's right.
that take time very seriously and are very interested in it. And psychology. And we haven't had, in a sense, this is not a criticism, but the focus has, in a sense, excluded some of the other scientific orientations to this topic. And if you take the focus on what we're calling conscious time, I mean, I totally agree with you that if you start trying to think about consciousness, we think of that in a very sort of thin way, as if there's this thing called consciousness, but then we start realizing actually it may be organized and structured by things that are not thinly described as conscious, like language. And then if we start taking language seriously, I think we get into not just understanding language per se, but also the different languages of psychoanalysis, history, literature, and so on, the uses of language and the theorizings through different discourses of what will eventually have an impact on consciousness. So I'm trying to say that what I've seen in this workshop is, in a sense, an attempt to link two poles, let's say physical time in the most fundamental way, and what we're calling conscious time. But in a sense, what it does for me is to open up all that stuff in the middle, where some of the thickness and wealth and richness that you're talking about would get elaborated. So I'm waiting for the next workshop.
Yeah, we'll have one. We've got to design it. I think, do you want to speak to Yuval first and then, or yes?
Just a follow-up, in fact, on what David just said. You described three groups here. Anthropological groups, philosophers of physics, analytic philosophers, continental philosophers, and then various times, cosmological time, conscious time, human time, psychological time, and there is some, not a very tight, but there's some correlation that we can make between the doctrines and the anthropological groups. And some of us, as it was already mentioned, participated in a workshop that was entitled "The Future of the Philosophy of Time." So if I can,
This is it.
This is part, now we're there. But I just wanted to make a little programmatic comment, which is that these divisions in a way disturb me. I think that there is an important sense in which there is one time, and these various polars and the in-between and so on are various ways of looking at one thing. And if we buy into the notion that there's physical time, experiential time, and they're really different, I think we may veer off a track that I think we should pursue. And to add to that, I think these divisions, first of all, I think sociologically they're beginning to melt a little bit, because I think more and more philosophers of physics are getting more interested, certainly in the analytic stuff, but even in continental stuff, and vice versa. So I think these sharp boundaries are beginning to dissolve a little bit, and I think that's a positive thing. So I would like in the future of the philosophy of time to see a workshop in which we no longer have these divisions, but are somehow able, all of us, to talk about this one thing from all these different angles.
One, and for that, and I'll be happy to fund that, which is more to the point. But you see, but the thing that I wanted to raise in relation to the last comment is that even before you get into psychoanalysis and literature and all the rest, you notice that despite what Chomsky thinks about a universal language, that in fact languages have extremely different ways of within one constant pattern of abutting the problem of time, of tense, of modality, of everything else. And I think it would repay us at some point to, and that's the question, whether you're interested in mapping the difference or you think all of the difference is trivial in relation to the issues that you're considering because it's all subsumed in some larger box. And that's a very great difference in approach. You had a comment.
Okay, I just wanted to go back to the discussion you had with me in the beginning and try perhaps to give it a slightly different spin. In this workshop, we talked a lot about the metaphysics of time and the phenomenology of time. One thing that we talked very little about was the epistemology of time. You know, if you look at the history of philosophy, you know, back in the olden days, so with Kant thought that our knowledge of the nature of time is entirely a priori, independent of experience. And then sometime in the 20th century, we ended up with people like Putnam, who in their quote by Yehiel basically said, well, look, philosophy of time, who in effect argue that our knowledge of the nature of time is entirely a posteriori, entirely empirical, and that all questions about the nature of time can and are be settled by physics. Now, I'm one of those people, and hopefully I'm not alone, who thinks that neither of these two extremes is correct, and that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that there are some aspects of the nature of time that are knowable independently of experience. Others are knowable through experience, so we've got philosophy settling some issues and physics settling the rest. And in my view, some of the disagreements that we had were partly about where precisely the dividing line between the empirical and non-empirical aspects of time are, and what precisely physics tells us about the nature of time, and what precisely we can determine through philosophical analysis alone about the nature of time. So that's, in my view, that's where the future of philosophy of time is hopefully going to make some progress in figuring out where this line is.
If I can react to that, abusing my position, which is that, you know, I'm always thinking of myself as a guy living 150,000 years ago on the African savannah. And what do I know and what don't I know? I haven't read any books. There are no roads. There are no plots. There are seasons about which I have some kind of vague idea. What I do know, however, is about a relationship of action and causality. And I do have a sense of before and after. It's not very big. You know, I'm not sure that I know anything about what happened to my parents or what will happen to my kids. Those time frames are already global. But I know that if I bang on the table, there's a cause and effect, and I know that that already has a time coefficient.
You didn't have any table 170.
No, I didn't have 170. But I know that I know where the honey is and where the tigers are, and all kinds of things, and I know that there is some kind of sequential relationship in my immediate world because I can't function without knowing it. In fact, it's not clear to me that dogs or cats don't know it either. You know, in other words, that it's far more basic than consciousness in ourselves, because if we would have no sense of time, and that's where I disagree with Kant, that he says it's the form of our inner intuition, and it's almost because he believes in the synthetic unity, and he doesn't raise that problem, that it's a form of species being. And I would think that any living anti-entropic organism has to have some sense of the relation. But organism has to have some sense of the relation between action and causality. The minute you have a barrier by which you can get food in and not immediately take it out, that requires you to have some sense of action and causality and sequence in a very primitive way. And that those things, I think, are primitives of our conception of time. I would think. I don't know. But that's just to answer that. Yes?
So you don't need consciousness for that?
You don't need consciousness for that. That's right. You don't need consciousness for that.
You need conscious time.
You don't need conscious time for that, but then it's not physical time either. And that's the comment that was raised about biological time. Because you have to think that there is a concept of biological time which is not like which is not like physical time, because physical time, we heard, is tense invariant. You can run it both ways. Biological time you can't run both ways, as we all know. And since you can't run it both ways, we get our sense of time from the fact, in our experience, from the fact that we're biological organisms. In other words, we get bored, we grow old, we die. And that's what Heidegger said basically too, but you don't have to give it a name like Heidegger. You just have to look at cells and ask, how do cells function? Because he thought it was about human beings who can ask the question of time. I don't think our sense of time, and that's why I disagree with him, comes at all from asking the question of time. It's just because that's the way we operate. And what I'm trying to point out is that I'm not sure that what we operate in is physical time. It's not human reflected time.
Yes, but on the other hand, if you take it seriously, if you take biological time seriously, for example, the fact that we're born babies and we die later on, old people and so on, if you take it seriously, and if you take physics seriously, and if you take the aspirations of physics seriously, physics has to deal with it.
Hasn't done it yet.
But it has to do, well, I think it can deal with it, actually, but forget about what I think. This is just a fact.
Oh, I agree.
That physics needs to explain it.
I think it's a very important thing, and that's why I said at the beginning of this conference that I'm designing a future conference where people who do physics and people who do biology get together to talk about this specific issue. Because I think this is one of the great unresolved conundrums of the sciences. The sense of time that you get from general relativity and the sense of time you get from the theory of evolution are contradictory in some basic ways.
Because conscious time is just a result of the biological.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, but that's something to discuss. But I think I think the point still has to be taken that, and this is what was said here, is that different sciences have different ideas of what time is. Even scientists do. Now, of course, you could say, like my son, that biology is not a science, and get out of the problem that way. But that's just like saying that at some point the word science then becomes meaningless.
But what about philosophers in this future?
Oh, well, we'll put them in there. We'll put philosophers. I personally would like to say one thing. I enjoyed this conference very much, and of course, this is the self-congratulatory moment where we all congratulate ourselves. But you see, therefore, I told that to Michael, and now I'll say that to Yuval as well, that I'm willing to organize an ongoing set of conferences to fund. In other words, an ongoing set of conferences. Maybe once every other year you have to give people some time to recover, but and they have to submit their articles if they want to hope to be invited again. But if they do submit their article on time and everything else, and you do get a volume out, then I would be very happy to fund an ongoing colloquium of a group of people on these issues. And that's what I do in life. I fund projects. Yes. Nick.
Well, I have something to say about my impression, and from the continental philosophers, I was deeply impressed by the richness of their discussion of time, and I've been motivated, or I am motivated, to look into some of the literature. From the philosophers, I related to my own thinking, and in particular with regard to Yuval's paper, which, if true, would make mincemeat of what I'm doing. So I've thought about it. I mean, I have some replies that have come up that make me feel that I could go on doing what I'm doing. Barry's paper is also something that interested me a lot, and helped me in my thinking. And from the physicists, and in particular from Mayer's paper, I came to see that if I understood your main point, which was that at the microdynamic level, that there is included in that very state a direction, and that but there's there's two directions depending upon whether you go in the blue arrow or the green arrow. So that from one point of view, A is earlier than B, and from the other, B is earlier than A. And so at that point, it seems to me there's still the task of the ontologist to distinguish the order of the relation.
But that becomes an epistemic problem. I mean, if you want to make physics, you have to do either the blue universe or the green universe. And then there's an epistemic question about which universe ours is. There's no physics without a direction of time. That's what I'm saying.
There is, it seems to me, a difference between A is earlier than B and B is earlier than A. And that difference needs to be grounded. And that's for philosophy.
It doesn't mean, however, that we can run the film backwards, so that the kissing couple is coming apart and then they move back. Like when I don't know if you've ever rewound the old 35mm films.
But it does mean that there's a difference between John loving Mary and Mary loving John.
Yes.
That difference needs to be.
I agree completely.
Even though you have the same terms and the same relation.
The other thing that I want to say, that in relation to your work, that the other thing that struck me, and I don't know if it's good or bad, but the degree to which the division of time into A and B and R has proved fecund for philosophers, because after all, this is a division that was made in the early 20th century, and that didn't exist before, and that did not exist as a result, I think, of relativity theory or anything else. It's a difference that was just made by McTaggart, intuitively on the basis of his reading of the literature, because he obviously had his own agenda, which was to destroy this notion, but that ever since, people have been arguing this, because immediately the idea of difference between tense and succession and boxes and lines became very clear to a lot of people, and it's been an enormous tool, and you're wondering how long it's going to go on for, and where does it all lead, but that's just a general observation. Did you want to, Michael, please?
Yeah, just maybe a remark from the continental side. Because I think that one of the things we're trying to do here is to see the continental view of philosophy or position in philosophy as a live position, and not just because you have, for example, a huge amount of literature on interpretation of Husserl, Heidegger, etc. But you have very few people who are thinking about time, and I think David is, for me, the exception, that are thinking about time from a continental perspective, but thinking about the problem of time and not about history of philosophy. So this is one of the things that I would like to encourage, that you take this position to think about time and to relate it to physical time, to the discussion in analytical philosophy, not as a history of philosophy.
I think that's very important. I would like to make it clear. I mean, if the university exists to fund lectures on Hegel's concept of time, or Quine's concept of time, or whatever it is, I hope that the added value that we have is really to, from all directions, no matter how crazy or how standard, to get inputs that can help us understand these set of problems better. And that the idea is that we're actually in a progressive effort to unpack a problem and see if there are temporary solutions that can be found to it. Now, I would like to agree to that. Would either of you like to say a closing word to the conference? Yes, so
moving.
Okay.
Since you probably were amazed by the way that Yuval and I are organized so well. So we have his beginning, I'm ending the conference. Everything was thought about meticulously for, it took us years to organize every minute of the conference. So first of all, we would like to thank all the participants, our guests. I think apart from the lively discussion, the atmosphere was great. So we had, I think, spent a very nice period of time together. And we would like to thank, first of all, again, Professor Motzkin and the Van Leer Institute, which enabled all that. Also the research group. In the research group, we had also psychology, but in the end, not everything fitted together. And it was more philosophic-oriented, so it ended that way, but I agree with your remark. And to thank also the Israeli Science Foundation that helped us finance this workshop, especially Shulamit Laron and Louis for really very helpful assistance in organizing all the administrative aspect of the conference. As Professor Motzkin already said, we intend to publish the proceedings of this conference, so we'll be in contact with you, and if you will be nice, and so maybe as a promise to the future, and I know that yesterday some of you were in the Israel Museum and you didn't have time to see everything, so if you behave correctly, we might help you see it again or something in the future, in the open future. So thank you very much, everybody. Okay, so for our guests now, for the participants, we have lunch, and after